In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, Professor Jenny Reid shares what goes on at the heart of a government invention agency. Today, we have with us Professor Jenny Reid. Jenny is a physicist and computational neuroscientist and one of the founding program directors at the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, known as ARIA. And Jenny, you're building a robotics program, which we'll come on to shortly. But before we do that, I just want to take a little um, track back into where it all began, I suppose, pre-Oxford, pre-Newcastle, back to primary. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Ruddington, which is a commuter village outside Nottingham in the Midlands.
Uh-huh. And when you were at school, at school in around there, and were you scientifically minded then, or was that a newer
Um,
development as you went along?
yeah, not really. When I was at primary school, I was very bookish. I was a sort of child that read a lot and wrote endless stories of my own. Um, Probably the earliest time I remember being inspired by science was through Doctor Who, actually. I was one of those kids in the 70s that was terrified by Doctor Who, probably deeply traumatized by some of the episodes, but I enjoyed the novels and I particularly enjoyed the wonderful words they had, which like radioactivity. I had no idea what it was, but it sounded amazing. But when I was, in primary school, I wanted to be a vet. I also very much enjoyed the novels of James Harriet. So yeah, I wasn't super scientific at school, and at primary school, and for example, I never really got on with maths because at primary school it all seemed to be about memorizing times tables, and it was very boring. But I did get into science probably through a ZX Spectrum computer that my lovely parents bought me when I was about 10. So you had 16K of RAM available to program with, and you had those amazing Usborne books where you could type in programs and they would enable you to play games. And then, you start thinking about how I might modify that to write a different game. And so I think that was probably how I first started thinking scientifically. And then when I got to secondary school, maths started to become algebra. And instead of just, times tables, I was like, oh, this is just like a variable in a computer program. Maybe this is interesting after all. And yeah, then I became quite scientific in secondary school.
That's so interesting. I'm quite curious to know what sort of stories you wrote, though, when you mentioned you were writing.
Mainly very long ones about horses.
Oh, really? You like
Yeah, I was a
horses?
pony man child.
Okay, fine. And did you ever actually make your own video game?
Oh yeah, I wrote, lots of incredibly basic games on the ZX Spectrum. I think one of the great things about that time was because it only had 16K of memory, the limit between, you in your living room as a 10-year-old and like the cutting edge state of the art wasn't that great. So I believe some of the games at the time were written by teenagers. And so yeah, what you could do yourself versus actual games, the gap didn't feel so big as it is now
Mm,
when, computer games are written by entire studios full of experts.
mm. There was a scene in that film Big where I think they were playing something very basic, and it seemed like they were making it up themselves as they went along. Yeah. Um, so into algebra and a bit more interesting maths. And what this is still before university though.
Mhm, yeah.
So what made you then choose what you chose at university? Did you have a particular teacher that had guided you that way, or was it all you or your
Oh
parents?
no, I had great teachers. Yeah, I was incredibly lucky. So Mr. Thomas was the head of physics and was very much, nurturing and actually all the teachers were. Mrs. Bell, Sylvia Bell was another physics teacher. I was also into classics and had wonderful classics teachers. So, it was definitely not all me. I was very lucky to have those great teachers at school. But I found physics the most inspiring, I think, because of things like, general relativity and quantum physics and all these amazing ideas that I would sort of read popular science books on and not really understand, but think this sounds incredible. I want to learn more about this.
Hmm. Hmm. So you chose to go down that route for university, and then what went into choosing the university? Was it very much, yes, I'm definitely going to go to Ox? Was it which was first? I've forgotten now, Oxford or Newcastle?
Oxford.
Oxford first.
Yeah, so I guess as an academic child of teacher parents, it was likely to give Oxbridge a shot. But I was
Mm,
very clear that I wanted to do physics, and at Oxford you could do physics, and at Cambridge you can't. You do natural sciences. So yeah, I applied to physics at Oxford.
hmm 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 Um, and um, and then you went on, you graduated, you then went to Newcastle, and
Yeah,
what
not
happened?
immediately, but
Not in,
eventually
oh
I
right,
ended up
well,
at Newcastle.
tell me about that. Tell me about that period, the Oxford to Newcastle moment.
Sure. So I did my undergraduate degree in physics at Oxford, and then I actually stayed on and did a DPhil, as Oxford calls a doctorate in theoretical astrophysics. But after that, by the time I was getting to the end of my doctorate, I was realizing that physics probably wasn't for me. And I was starting to look into neuroscience. I did some open university courses in biology and neuroscience and started thinking about, could I transition to neuroscience? Um, and then yeah, so I was looking into that, and I actually it was funny because I really had no idea how to do this, and actually I think at the time, so this is yeah 96, 97, it was actually a lot harder to find out information because the internet was only just getting started. So maybe people, young people listening nowadays will think, how could you be so clueless? But I'm like, honestly, it was just harder then to find out about anything. But I did apply. I applied to do a postdoc in neuroscience at Oxford with a kind of like slightly hopeless cover letter going, I'm doing a physics PhD, I'll probably be useless, but I'm interested. And they very kindly invited me along and said, yes, you would be useless for the particular postdoc we're advertising, but we're interested in meeting someone who's interested in neuroscience. And yeah, absolutely, there are things you could contribute. So um, the person I ended up speaking to there was Julian Jack, who's been a mentor ever since, really. He is a very distinguished electrophysiologist and neuroscientist, and he's very open to people from maths and physics working in biology. And he supported me to apply to the Wellcome Trust for a training fellowship in mathematical biology, which they were offering at that time, exactly for people like me to transition from physics and maths and quantitative science into biosciences. So I got that, which enabled me to have a 4-year fellowship. And I worked in Julian's lab, and I also did a master's in neuroscience as part of my fellowship, which was great to actually get some biological knowledge because I had, at that time, my highest biological qualification was GCSE.
Mm.
Great to have that opportunity. And then, as part of my project for my master's degree, I worked with a chap called Bruce Cumming, who then was at Oxford, but shortly afterwards went to set up his own lab at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, in the US. And as I was finishing my fellowship and looking out for what shall I do next, he offered me a postdoc at his lab at NIH. So I ran that past my husband. Like, I've just been offered a job in America. What do you think? We ended up moving to Bethesda, Maryland for 4 years. Um, and it was at the end of that period that I came back to Newcastle with a university research fellowship from the Royal Society.
Wow, so it really, really was quite a big experience. I kind of want to hear a little bit more about your time in America
Mm.
and how did you settle in and what were you working on?
Yeah, I had a great time there. We both did. We really loved our 4 years in the States. So, as I said, I was working in Bruce Cummings' lab on basically stereoscopic vision and how it's enabled by, you know, computations in cortical neurons. So Bruce very much uses stereoscopic vision as a model perceptual system, and he introduced me to that idea, which I think was really powerful. So the point about stereopsis is it's about getting perception of depth based on small differences in the images seen between your two eyes. So you can see that if you hold up a finger in front of your face and close one eye and then the other eye, you'll notice that the background seems to jump, between one eye and the other eye. And your brain can actually detect those tiny differences and use them to infer information about depths. The nice thing about it is you can kind of dissect it out from all other information about depths through using highly artificial stimuli called random dot stereograms. So they look something like the snow on an untuned television from the pre-digital era, when you just have this sort of cloud of dots. But the pattern is actually shifted between the left and right eyes. So if you have stereo vision and you perceive that through an appropriate 3D display system, what you see is like a noise pattern, but a chunk of it has been cut out and is being displayed on a surface that's nearer than the rest of it. If this is making sense, it's a little hard to sort of.
The way you've described it makes me think of the magic eye images.
It's exactly like the magic eye images. It's the same effect. Um, those are just technically a little harder to see because they rely on you being able to cross your eyes and focus independently on where you're converging your eyes. So they
Mhm.
require a bit more effort from the observer, but you're absolutely right. It's exactly that effect. So the nice thing about that is the we call it binocular disparity, this shift between left and right eye images. That's the only cue to depth. In the natural world, there are many cues to depth. There's like shading, motion, occlusion, perspective, any number of clues which artists can use to make a flat sheet of paper look like a 3D object. But in the random dot stereogram, there's only disparity. So now you can ask, okay, where in the brain is sensitive to that disparity? There are some neurons in, say, primary visual cortex, which seem to encode that. And then you can ask questions about how do they do that? How do they change as you vary the depth? How do they change as you vary um, we're getting a bit technical, the spatial frequency information in the stimulus and so on. So you can try and relate the behavior of the neurons to the perceptual experience of the observer. And it's just a very nice, simple, and kind of isolated model system to study. So that was a very long answer to your question. What was I doing at NIH? Essentially, I was building computational models of what we think these neurons are doing and comparing them with results from experiments in Bruce's lab.
And what application does that have in life?
So it doesn't have any super immediate application, but the big question it's addressing is how on earth does spiking activity in neurons relate to your conscious experience? What's happening in your brain when you perceive something, which I think is a super important question.
Mm.
Uh, Really important for just understanding who we are. I suppose it actually ended up this type of research, not mine personally, ended up being much more directly applicable than I kind of had imagined because the sort of models that people have written of these nerve cells in primary visual cortex um, basically inspired a series of artificial models called convolutional neural networks, which then, when they were folded into deep learning systems, underpin all our modern image recognition software. So all the modern generative AI that involves images, so whether that's face recognition or the video software, generating where you type in a prompt and it gives you 20 seconds of a video, all that ultimately depends on the understanding of these neurons in visual cortex that goes back to the 1960s, the Nobel Prize winners Hubel and Wiesel. So actually that sort of tradition of research has been enormously productive and impactful. Um, I can't claim that my own particular work on stereoscopic encoding of disparity has been impactful, but who knows, maybe one day.
It certainly seems to have been impactful for you because it's built your repertoire and in some part I'm sure has led to what you're doing now, which is incredibly impactful. Or at least it certainly seems like it's going to be as we move into that robotics era. But I don't want to jump ahead too much. Because you came back from America and then you were at Newcastle. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I arrived back in Newcastle with a baby and uh, started my own lab there. I was now
With a crash?
with a crash with my daughter in nursery, um, and I was looking to again continue my computational work, but whereas I had been previously embedded in an experimental lab, and now I was found in my own lab, and I didn't intend to do animal experiments, but to continue working, with other people using their data there and collecting data on human perceptual experience. So I did a lot of what's called psychophysics, so doing very detailed models of human depth perception and motion perception And again, trying to link those to theories about how we perceive. So you can have these theories about, okay, well, this is our computational model of what's going on in someone's brain when they combine images from the two eyes. So we predict that if we show people this particular weird and complicated stimulus, it will either, make them better or make them worse at these types of depth judgments. And then you collect information to test whether that's right. And if it isn't, then you say, well, maybe we need to adapt our theories in this direction. And then you go around the loop again.
And what are the, I want to say extent, what's the extent of the ability to incorporate the controllables in that area when it comes to things that we see every day, for example, advertising? Because I think if you could use that sort of thing, and maybe it already is happening, and I'm completely unaware. Um,
So to answer the question maybe more generally about applications of vision science, that's actually something I've worked on as well, actually, that I've collaborated with various industrial partners who are interested in understanding, how people perceive images. So one area where I think psychophysics has been very relevant is helping engineers understand what they need to prioritize when creating visual displays for us. So it's one of the reasons there are so many people studying vision is because it's an easy thing to study because of all the great display devices we have to generate stimuli. But the reason why there are all those great display devices like computer monitors and televisions and so on is because humans are very visual creatures. So that's really important to us. So we've engineered, we put the effort into engineering those. I guess if dogs were as intelligent as humans, we'd have lots of great odor creation devices. But because we're visual, we have visual displays. And we're always trying to make them better, right? We'd like the television to look more like the real world. So vision scientists can help engineers understand what's important. One thing engineers often want to do is increase the spatial resolution. But for example, I'd argue that there's no need to do that now. Today's high definition televisions are already so good that there's really no point in adding more pixels. But on the temporal domain, actually there could be a lot better. So you would have fewer artifacts if the refresh rate were faster. And that's something you see prioritized a lot in computer games, for example. Or if the color gamut were better, or if the dynamic range were wider. So those are the kind of questions, vision scientists can help with. Or when I'm encoding this image and sending it over the internet and I'm going to throw away some information, help me understand what information I should throw away in order to have least impact on the quality of the image. And the
mm,
stereo displays, stereo research in particular, it's a bit of an ongoing problem. People are trying to make 3D displays. It's sort of gone in waves. Famously, 3D displays have gone in sort of 30-year timescale waves since about the 1920s. And we haven't, it's never gone mainstream, right? I'm talking to you now on a flat 2D display panel. And maybe one day in the future we will have 3D displays being ubiquitous. Maybe if head-mounted displays become common, then they're sort of innately 3D because they have a separate display device for each eye, obviously being head-mounted. So it's inevitably you're providing separate images to the two eyes, so why not make the image 3D? But there's all kinds of complications about making that look good to human observers. So
mm,
I've worked with display engineers on those sort of problems.
mm. It's exciting actually the idea of the headsets and because it seems a little bit well immersive because of course you can reach into it and touch and move and all the rest of it. So let's come back to the lab in Newcastle that you set up and you did and how long were you there for?
I started my lab in 2005 and I've been there ever since.
Right. Excellent. And so then I guess that does bring us onto ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, which came about from a parliamentary act quite
That's right.
recently, 2002.
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah,
the agency itself was started in January 2023.
yeah, brand new. And you're one of the founding program
That's
directors.
right. I was actually the first to join,
Really, the very first.
very
Wow.
first ARIA program director.
And was it robotics immediately that's the program you were developing?
Yes, it was. And I could tell you a bit about how that came to be because I realise it's probably sounding a bit strange having talked a lot about vision and then to go and work on robotics. But after all these years studying essentially human stereoscopic vision, my career took a bit of a sideways turn when I bumped into a colleague in the in the coffee room at work, Candy Row, and she was working on camouflage in praying mantids. So she'd just taken a delivery of praying mantids, and she was telling me they're amazing insects. They're so cool. You should come and have a look at them. They've got stereo vision. And I was like, what? No, insects don't have stereoscopic vision. That is a highly complex ability only possessed by the higher mammals. And she was like, no, no, they've got stereo vision. There's a Nature paper about it from 1980. And I was, mind blown. But I read up on it, and of course she was completely right. There was this fabulous paper by Samuel Rossell in 1980, doing a really neat experiment with some prisms and testing a praying mantis. And you see, the nice thing about praying mantis is that they have this predatory strike behavior. So, they lie in wait, and then when a prey comes within range, they reach out and try and grab it. So, because they're ambush predators, they don't want to give themselves away to the prey by striking, when the prey's out of reach. So they have to know when the prey is within range. And Russell showed that they do this by basically triangulating between their two eyes, which is stereoscopic vision. And so I was like, wow, that's amazing. Everyone in my field thinks stereoscopic vision is really complicated and involves millions of neurons in many different visual cortical areas. But the praying mantis has only got like a maximum of 1 million neurons. So how is it doing this? So I was like, somebody needs to study this. So I wrote a research proposal to the Leverhulme Trust for a research leadership award, saying, we should totally investigate this because it's like it seems a niche question, but I think it's actually quite important because how are insects doing stereoscopic vision? Um, if it's essentially the same as humans do it, then that would be, I think, really informative because it would clearly have evolved completely separately, right? Because even eyes evolved independently in insects and humans. So definitely stereoscopic vision would have evolved independently. So if they've converged on the same algorithm, I think that would be really strong evidence that that algorithm is like the one good way to do stereoscopic vision. But perhaps more likely, given that their brains are so small, maybe they found a different way of doing stereoscopic vision. And then that would be important to understand because it would presumably be much computationally cheaper to implement. And so then it might be useful in robotics, for example. Like if you want to have a lightweight autonomous drone, with a limited battery life, you don't want to churn up, use up its battery churning through a very complex stereopsis algorithm. You should use a cheap insect stereo algorithm if that is available. And so the Leverhulme Trust bought that argument and funded me to study insect vision. And that was how I started to get into robotics and think about how could you use insect-inspired algorithms in robotics. So then when I started at ARIA, that was the direction I thought my program would go into.
Mm.
But when you work at ARIA, when you begin, they say, go off, just do some discovery and figure out what is a promising opportunity space in ARIA terms. And they define an opportunity space as an area that's very important, but underserved and underinvested in relative to that importance, and also ripe. So there's some reason why the time to attack it is now. And in the course of my discovery, I realised that actually novel algorithms for robotics, I don't think is underserved, whereas robot hardware came to seem to me both important and very much underserved. So that's where I'm focusing my opportunity space.
I see, how interesting. Um, it's actually interesting to hear you say, even use the words algorithm in terms of the natural world,
Mm.
because it's not something I think that most of us associate with the natural world. We think that's very much a computational thing and very much man-made.
Yes, it's funny sometimes when you hear people, I don't know, arguing about how ChatGPT can't possibly be conscious because it's just doing a set of mathematical computations. Right? It's basically linear algebra with a few non-linearities. And I'm like, well, in neuroscience, that's basically what we think the brain is doing. So I'm not sure that argument is as compelling as you think it is.
Indeed, indeed. So just explain to me that how ARIA works in terms of building the program, because it's a series of funding opportunities to do, but just give us a bit more of an idea of the criteria and the focus and
Yeah, so
thresholds.
how as you know, ARI is a very brand new agency, and
Mm,
the approach that its founding CEO Ilan Gur has taken is very much to focus on people, then projects. So rather than saying, okay, ARIA is going to have programs in, the following areas, what they instead did is go out and recruit the first cohort of program directors and give us tremendous carte blanche to decide what we wanted to research, subject to these criteria that I was explaining, that the opportunity space has to be important, underserved, and ripe. So
Hmm.
they recruited 8 program directors who are working on 7 programs because 2 of them are co-PDs. And yeah, then we went out and identified our opportunity spaces, and they are across the whole of science, but they weren't specified in a top-down way. And
Hmm.
then we're trying to iterate that down again, really. So when we issue our call for programs, we're trying to be very much open to ideas from the community and look for people who we think have got really promising ideas and great motivation and try and
Hmm.
support them.
And you've just done a round of funding, is that right?
That's right. So this first cohort is going through, and one after another, we're all launching our programs. We're all at different stages. I'm at the stage where I earlier this year launched my call for research in hardware to support robot dexterity. That's what I'm focusing on. I've had some great proposals, I've reviewed them along with external evaluators, and we've made a selection of who we'd like to fund. And we're currently in the stage of negotiating contracts and fine tuning milestones. And we're hoping the first project will be starting in the new year.
How wonderful. This is such an exciting time.
Yeah, it really is.
But just to put everyone's mind at ease, we're effectively developing robots now to perhaps help out in labs and when we say improve dexterity or
Mm.
assist in dexterity, let's just look at that for a minute and focus on how that can be useful in a lab and how it's more of a supportive approach rather than anything that's going to take over anything.
Right. Yeah, I certainly hope it isn't going to take over. But I think I'm not a wet lab expert, but I visited various wet labs. For example, I was lucky enough to have a tour of the Crick Institute recently near ARIA's headquarters. And it's clear that there's a lot of fairly repetitive work, which at the moment is being done by human beings, some of which could, in principle, be done by robots even today. But there are barriers to do with just setting things up, especially if it's a relatively short-term thing because it's an experiment and you're only going to be doing this for 2 weeks and then you'll be doing something different. At the moment, the barrier to setting that up with a robot can be too great. And there are other tasks that current robots just can't do. I mean, some of the tasks that have been mentioned to me as problematic are taking solids handling, so taking a certain amount of powder out of a jar, and then maybe stirring that with the appropriate speed and motion. And I think it would be very helpful if robots were able to achieve those kind of dexterities so that those kind of routine tasks, surely as a scientist, you'd like to be able to say, please do this for me, rather than you yourself having to do those relatively mundane tasks. And it
Mm,
frees you up to do the more interesting and intellectually exciting work.
mm, mm. And are you having any impact, or do you think the program have impact about the type of people? I mean, you said it's a person-led research outfit anyway. But so what sort of impact do you think that'll have on the type of people in robotics per se?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a relatively small program. It's a large amount of money in absolute terms. We're spending around 50 million on investment in this program. But in terms of like the field of robotics, that's a small amount of money. So I'm not sanguine enough to think that we're going to change the field of robotics entirely. But I think I'm really excited about the people that we're funding. We're funding some great people within robotics, which is amazing, to enabling them to work on things that they wouldn't be able to do within the current framework and the current funding opportunities that have been available to them. I'm
Mm,
also really excited that we're bringing some great people from outside robotics who've been attracted by the programme and they weren't already working within robotics. So that feels really exciting.
mm. It does feel really exciting. We'll all be watching this with particular interest now to see how it progresses. Um, I just there's some that I normally end with asking a question. What are your hopes for the future of science? And I almost perhaps know, and or what would be one thing you would change about science if you could. And normally might give you a heads up, but I feel like I'm sort of dropping you in it a little bit, saying it now. So I don't know if we want to talk about something else while you have a think about that, or if you're happy to answer one of those questions now.
I can take that. Can I answer both if I do it quickly?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
It's, so I think one thing I'd change about science to strike a slightly negative note, I've been very concerned recently with some of the things that are coming to light about falsification and fraudulent results in science. I mean, I don't need to tell anyone just how corrosive that is, right? The entirety of science depends on correct reporting of results. So the idea that some of these stories that have come out recently about really senior people apparently having presided over fraudulent papers is incredibly concerning. So something I would like to change about science is to figure out how we can root that out. I don't know quite what form that takes. I feel like serious consequences for people who do it is probably part of it, and maybe better AI tools for automatically detecting these discrepancies. I think one of the reasons they're coming to light now is that there are tools for detecting image manipulation, for example, that just weren't there in the past. So that's a slightly negative thing I'd like to change about science. But to end on a more positive note, my sort of hopes for the future, as I'm sure you're predicting at the moment, are very much focused on my programme and my amazing researchers that I'm lucky enough to be able to fund. I'm so excited about all the plans they've got, and my hopes are that they just come to fruition.
Yeah, I hope so too. I want to go back just to the negative one just for a
Yeah.
minute, and I don't want to end on that, so we'll come back to something else. But what is there? Was there an example that you wanted to sort of highlight about the falsification of papers?
Well,
I
the one that comes to mind is the head of the National Institute of Aging.
mm,
There's, I mean, I, I think nothing's definite at the moment, but there was a very worrying report in Science about something like 24 papers where serious questions had been raised. And
mm,
it's very shocking because he worked on Alzheimer's. So it's a super important thing. It's not insect stereopsis, it's the sort of research that underpins multi-million pound clinical trials. So if there's any suggestion that the data underpinning that has been manipulated in some way, that's obviously incredibly concerning.
mm,
And my sense is it's not a one-off, right? At the moment, it feels like every few months more things are coming to light, and we're
mm.
obviously going to lose public trust and jeopardize funding unless we really get our house in order.
Mm. Yes, that is important. And so many things are, are open to people's thoughts about them these days. Everyone, instead of wondering about what's real and what's not, they think about how they feel and what they think about something. So it feels like the under attack from two angles, perhaps. If but maybe that's why that's an area that has been put into jeopardy ultimately because there is a lot of money involved, and we need to tighten things up from that perspective. Who knows? But yeah, back to the future, back to the robotics program. Yes, I hope it all comes to fruition. We'll be looking out for it. When should we start looking things up? Will there be a particular time? Can we look on a website somewhere?
Yes, in fact, next week you can look on our website to find our seed creators announced. So earlier this year, we selected
Well,
a
wait,
small.
I'll just stop there because this is recorded, so this everything will probably be live by the time this is going live. So yes,
Sorry.
the website.
So yeah, the website will have our seed creators. So these are a group of people that we selected over the summer for relatively small awards, seeding innovative research within the wider opportunity space. So these are people who are not necessarily focusing on dexterity, but on other aspects of robotics. So you'll be able to find those people on our website and see what they're doing. And they include, for example, a cardiologist who became interested in motors through his work founding a company to build a left ventricular assist device to help with heart failure, but it uses innovative bearingless motors. And he's realised that they could have tremendous potential in robotics for enabling highly efficient motors that are resistant to wear and enable new modes of motion, like maybe a shoulder joint that can move in many directions at once. So we've given him a Seed Award to explore that. So you'll be able to find on our website in due course details of all the researchers who've been selected for funding. In terms of when they're going to produce exciting results, my programme's relatively long term. It extends over a 5 year period. And due to the nature of the research, most people are probably going to take, at least 2 years before they have anything really transformative to show. But I'm hoping we can keep on doing updates on our website and on our Substack as things become available. We
Mhm.
also have a sign up for updates button on the ARIA website. So if anyone listening to this is interested, please just go there and sign up to hear all about what we're up to.
Mhm. And let's just hear what the website address is.
Website is www.aria.org, O-R-G.uk.
www.aria.org.uk.
That's it.
Lovely. And we'll all subscribe and read the Substack, and then we'll keep
Please
up
do.
to date with everything that's happening. Jenny, thank you so much, Professor Jenny Reid. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and hearing about everything that you've been doing and that you're going to be doing in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.